19, and we'll start reading in verse 23. The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. And you'll recall from last week, he was told to flee to the mountains. He felt like that was not possible. And he says, look, there's this small city over here. It's far enough away. Can we go there? And he was told, yes, go there, but we can't do anything until you get there, so go now. And so he gets to Zoar. The sun now has come up, and it says, Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. How did he do that? There's a reason I'm asking that question. There's a lot of folks out there that want to speculate. First off, they want to speculate where these cities were, and it's not completely clear exactly where they were located. A lot of scholars put them at the very southern tip of the Dead Sea. Other people say that's not possible because they read this verse and are convinced that all this means is that a volcano erupted, and there's no volcanoes in that part of the world. But it doesn't say that a volcano erupted. It says that the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And that's literally all that it says. It doesn't say how he made it happen. It doesn't say what. It just says that he made it happen. And that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind. Is he dependent upon there being a volcano on the earth in a particular place in order to make this happen? The answer is no. He made the earth and all that's in it. He made man from the dust of the ground. If he wants to rain fire and sulfur out of heaven, he doesn't need there to be some natural phenomenon that allows the mantle of the earth to come out. He can produce these things however he wishes them. At one point, Jesus explains to the scribes and the Pharisees, who were all caught up on this idea of being the literal physical descendants of Abraham, that if it was actual literal descendants of Abraham that the Lord wanted, he could raise them up out of the stones off the ground. He doesn't need and isn't limited the way that we are. What's important is that this is his judgment. It came from him. This was no mere act of nature. This was God at work. The Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. How total was the destruction? It was absolute. He destroyed all the inhabitants. He destroyed what was growing. He destroyed everything and all the cities in the valley. But Lot's wife, behind him, looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. They were told to flee. They were told not to look back. Can someone please explain to me what is so horrible about looking over your shoulder? That's the only answer. There's not anything particularly horrible about it, except for the fact that they were told by God, what? Don't do it. So, when we read a command of God, and we say, well, that doesn't seem all that bad. Why shouldn't we be able to do thus and so? When he says that we shouldn't engage in fornication, for instance, and obviously the world around us engages in fornication freely, and they don't fall over dead, and nothing horrible seems to come out of it. And that's the way people think, by the way. Wait a minute, we're made to do this, and it feels good, and it's part of our makeup. It's how God made us. Certainly he intends for us to enjoy these things. Why would he forbid Does it matter whether or not it makes sense to us? Does it matter whether or not we understand the problem? Does it matter whether or not it seems like a big deal to us? And the answer is no. Lot's wife lost her life because she looked back. And the only thing that made looking back a problem is that God said what? Don't do it. Now, we can make the suggestion, and I think it's profitable to make it, and I'll assert it a little bit stronger later, that what it's indicative of is her longing for her life in Sodom. And that really is where the problem lies. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So she looks back, she turns to a pillar of salt, and Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down, and by the way, this is where he's talking to the angels of the Lord, negotiating with them. He goes back to look down upon the valley and to see what has happened. Because keep in mind, Abraham leaves this with, if I find 10 righteous souls, I won't destroy them. I'll preserve them for the 10. So he goes the next morning and he looks at the place, and it says he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley, and looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So what does Abraham see? Well, he sees that God did in fact destroy it as he said that he was going to. You know what that means, right? There were not 10 righteous people in Sodom, Gomorrah, or any of the cities of the valley. There weren't 10 righteous people. I am hopeful that there are more than 10 righteous people sitting in this room right now. In all of those cities, there could not be found 10 righteous people. How bad was things? And we're really, I think I said this last week in that I was going to do it, and I didn't do it again. I didn't pull out and do the work on finding out exactly how much time had elapsed between Noah and this. I'm going to do that before we quit, I hope. But remember that at Noah's day, there was only evil in the minds of man continually, and that's the reason why he destroyed the world through a flood. And here we've got this whole region, and already it has descended into the point where there's not even 10 righteous people within the cities of this entire region. And so one of the things that we can take from this is that we can quickly degenerate to the point that we don't recognize God, that we don't recognize righteousness, that we don't respect doing good. We can quickly find ourselves in a situation where there are none who are righteous. How many people escaped? Well, let's keep reading. We're going to find out. We know that Lot's wife didn't, right? He looked down, and all the smoke's coming up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. Now, Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. And so, after he negotiated to stop in Zoar because he didn't want to go to the hills, he saw what took place and what happened to him. He was frightened. And so he went to the hills. He lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. How many people is that? 3. If I can find 10 righteous souls, I will not destroy. How many people got out? 3. Do we have 3 righteous souls? Let's keep reading. The firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come in after us in the manner of all the earth. That was a really, really, really polite way of saying what? There's not any way for us to have children. Now, this is how widespread the destruction was. They're convinced that there are no men left on the earth, that it's just the three of them, and that the prospects of them having children and repopulating the earth are zero. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we'll lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she rose. The next day the firstborn said to the younger, Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger rose and lay with him, and did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab, the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ammi. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. So when you read throughout the rest of the book, you hear about the Moabites and the Ammonites, you now know where they came from. Did God send his messenger to them and say, I'm going to destroy the world? No, that's what he did in Noah's day, right? And in fact, when they came off the ark, he said to them what? Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth. Do you notice we read nothing about that instruction in this story? What the indication is that they were living not by faith, but living by sight. They looked at the destruction that was around them. They were overtaken by how great it was. There was no one left alive. They were completely lost. And they began to plot to do something to have children that it's clear they know their father would never agree to. How is it clear that their father wouldn't agree to it? They had to get him drunk. They said, hey, let's do this thing, but we're going to have to get a drink first, because if he's not drunk, he's certainly not going to let this happen. By the way, this is a great place to talk about the problems with the use of alcohol. This is what you're willing to do under the influence of alcohol. Things that you would never, ever, ever even consider doing when you're sober. Yes, ma'am. Well, that was an idiomatic way of saying bearing children. In other words, what she was saying in verse 31 was, there are no men left for us to marry. We're not going to be able to get a husband and have children the way that people go about their life and have offspring, so we have to go to this extreme length. She's justifying the incest, is what she's doing. Now, this is important to note that this is before the law of Moses was given, and some of those definitions had not been revealed to man. I'm not certain that it was as repulsive to them with the information that they have as it should be to us with the information that we have. But it was bad enough that righteous Lot would never have done it, because they understood that the only way they could get him to go along with their plan was to get him drunk. Not once, but twice. And so the fact that they plotted, that they planned, that they schemed, that they knew that Lot didn't want to do this and that they would have to get him drunk to get him to do it and them to be able to work out their plan, all of that indicates morality issues among them. So though they actually escaped with Lot, could we argue that their righteousness still yet lacked something? They had enough righteousness to listen to their father when he said, come on, let's go. Keep in mind, they had been engaged. Remember that? They had betrothed themselves, and Lot went to his future sons-in-law and said, come on, we have to get out. God's going to destroy it. And those sons-in-laws refused to go. That's how we get to this place. They were at least righteous enough that they listened to their father and they left the city. They were at least righteous enough that they didn't look back the way that their mother did, and they survived up to this point. But under the circumstances of life now, they cave. They cave to the desires of the flesh. Not that they desired their father simply for the sake of the physical interaction with him. They desired to have children and to procreate, and their betrothed were just killed along with everybody else. And they didn't see a future. And so they made their own path. They decided how they should live in order to accomplish the things that they wanted to accomplish, and this is what it led to. Every way of right is right in his own eyes. They were convinced that they were doing the right thing. When we read it, we find offense with it. By the way, I taught this one time from the pulpit, this story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And as I got to the end of the story of the destruction of Sodom, I had enough time left in the lesson, so I went ahead and included a discussion about this section in the sermon, and I was chastised by someone who said I shouldn't talk about those things from the pulpit. My response was, it's in the book. There's a reason why it's there, and there's something we're supposed to learn from it. And it's not done simply to offend the senses. It's done to teach the lessons. These are the kinds of things that we are willing to do when we rely upon our own judgment instead of listen to the judgment of God. These two girls were not completely bad people. They were generally good people. They lived in a righteous household. They were trained by a righteous man. They listened to him. They believed that God was going to destroy the city. They left with their father. They didn't look back like they were told not to do. They did everything right up to this point, but then the circumstances changed, and all of a sudden, in life circumstances, they decided this is the only way forward for us, and they made a bad choice. How could that happen to us? Well, I'll tell you how that could happen to us. We lose our job. And the bills keep coming. And the debt collectors continue to call and say, hey, we need our money. And we can't find a job, and we're desperate. And so we start cutting corners and justifying. Justifying theft, justifying other illegal activity. Because we need these things. And this is the only way we see that we can do it. That's how people end up in jail. That's how people end up cooking meth. That's how women end up being prostitutes. because they find themselves in life circumstances and they think the only way that they can get forward and get the things that they need are to take this path. That's what Lot's daughters did. And it's a warning for us. That if we walk by sight rather than by faith, we will do the same things. You can't say, oh, I would never do that. Yes, you would. Unless you hold your faith in God and you trust Him. Every one of us have been willing to transgress. We have to be careful, because this is what happens. Let's look at other references to this story to see just what a big effect it really has on things. Flip over to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 29 and verse 23. Let's actually back up to verse 22. The next generation, your children who rise up after you, the foreigner who comes in from a far land, will say, when they see the afflictions of that land and the sickness with which the Lord has made it sick, the whole land burned out with brimstone and salt, nothing sown, nothing growing, where no plant can sprout, an overthrow like that of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in His anger and wrath. All the nations will say, why has the Lord done this to the land? What has caused the heat of this great anger? A reminder of God's judgment against Sodom and Gomorrah in those cities, and the extent of that judgment and how far it went. It was so great after it happened. Not only was everything that was growing destroyed, but what's it say? It wouldn't grow. The whole land burned out with brimstone. Nothing sown, nothing growing, no plant can sprout. Like that of Sodom and Gomorrah. So, to help these people understand the seriousness and the depth and the greatness of the judgment of God against people who do evil, He reminds them that this wouldn't be a new thing. This is something that we have an example of. It's like Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's go to the prophet Isaiah, chapter 3. Verse 9. This is a chapter dealing with the judgment of God on Judah and on Jerusalem many years after the Sodom and Gomorrah event. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, which is what I want to do, but let's just focus on verse 9. As he's describing their circumstances and he's describing what's going to happen and he's describing why it's going to happen, he says this, for they look on the look on the face bears witness against them. They proclaim their sin like Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to them. And see, the fact of the matter is, within the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, they didn't try to hide the evil that they did. They didn't do it under cover of night when no one would see them. They didn't do it behind closed doors where no one would see them. They did it openly. A couple of people come in the city that are new and strange, and we want to know them. Lot's taking them to his house. Well, let's go to Lot's house. This is an open proclamation. We want those strangers so we can know them. They didn't hide what their intention was with them. They made it very clear what they intended to do. They were not ashamed. And he is using that to tell Judah and Jerusalem, you're not any different. In another place, it's described as they didn't know how to blush. They didn't have a sense of shame about doing wrong anymore. That's what was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. That's what was going on in Noah's day. Evil was the way, not the exception. Righteousness was the exception. Look at chapter 13 and verse 19. He's talking here about his judgment against Babylon. And he says, in Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, it was a great nation. The glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans. This great city with all of its wealth and all of its pomp and all of its glory and was the envy of the world will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. To describe the breadth of his judgment against this place, he reminds the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. You kind of see a theme in how this is making an appearance as we continue to look at this. A reminder of God's absolute judgment and his total judgment and the seriousness of God when he says that something will be, that's exactly what will happen, that's exactly what he intends, that's... Are there exceptions to the judgment of God? Only those that he makes. Noah and his household. Lot. Only the exceptions that God makes. Otherwise, there are no exceptions. Jeremiah chapter 23 and verse 14. But in the prophets of Jerusalem, I have seen a horrible thing. They commit adultery, walk in lies. They strengthen the hands of evildoers so that no one runs from his evil. So not only are they engaged in immorality, not only are they liars, but they encourage other people who are doing evil. They strengthen the hands of evildoers so that no one turns from his evil. They don't warn anyone about the judgment to come. All of them have become like Sodom to me, and its inhabitants like Gomorrah. And so again, he's describing lying prophets who don't fulfill their responsibility, who aren't preachers of righteousness, who don't speak true the words of God. And he says they're like the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah. Look at Lamentations. Chapter 4 and verse 6. For the chastisement of the daughter of my people has been greater than the punishment of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment, and no hands were wrung for. Listen, I want you to think about what it's saying there for just a moment. Number one, it affirms the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah as a fact. Then it says it was overthrown in a moment. It didn't take days or weeks God rained destruction down on them. It was done. All that was left was the burning, which Abraham witnessed. No hands were wrung for. What does that mean? Anybody have any thoughts about what that's suggesting? Nobody mourned. There wasn't any consternation at all about the fact that all of those people had just been destroyed. They were not likable people. And nobody missed them. Is that the kind of people you want to be? Because that's the kind of people we become when we engage in fornication, in adultery, in immorality, in ungodliness, when we lie and we cheat and we steal. We become those kinds of people. We're just like the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And instead of people weeping at our loss, they say nice things like, couldn't happen to a nicer guy. Which, by the way, should never be said about anybody, no matter how bad they are. Because the Bible affirms the value of human life. The Bible affirms that all men are created in the image of God. The Bible affirms that all men have valuable souls that are worth more than the entire earth and all that it contains. One man's soul. But you know what? If we throw the faith of God out of the window, and we throw His instructions out of the window, and we don't listen to Him, and we look at things through our own eyes, we say things like, I'm going to dance on your grave. Because we become godless. Look at the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 16. We're going to start reading in verse 44. Behold, everyone who uses proverbs will use this proverb about you, like mother, like daughter. You are the daughter of your mother who loathed her husband and her children. You are the sister of your sisters who loathe their husbands and their children. Your mother was a Hittite, your father an Amorite. Your elder sister is Samaria, who lived with her daughters to the north and of you, and your younger sister, who lived to the south of you, is Sodom with her daughters. Not only did you walk in their ways and do according to their abominations, within a very little time you were more corrupt than they in all your ways. As I live, declares the Lord God, your sister Sodom and her daughters have not done as you and your daughters have done. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. And this is an important passage, because we're going to find out there's a whole lot more problems in Sodom than just their sexual deviancies. This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, prosperous ease, but they did not aid the poor and the needy. They were haughty and didn't an abomination before me, so I removed them when I saw it. Samaria has not committed half your sins. You've committed more abominations than they, and have made your sisters appear righteous by all the abominations that you have committed. And so, through the prophet Ezekiel, he's actually telling the people of God, listen, you're so bad, you make Sodom look good. Don't think that it can't happen to us. Bear your disgrace, you also, for you have intervened on behalf of your sisters, because of your sins, which you acted more abominably than they are more in the right than, or they are more in the right than you. So be ashamed. Bear your disgrace, for you have made your sisters appear righteous. You know what that's a call to do? To confess and repent. Bear your shame. Simply saying, recognize what you've done, recognize your guilt, be ashamed about it. I will restore their fortunes, both the fortunes of Sodom and her daughters, and the fortunes of Samaria and her daughters. I will restore your own fortunes in their midst, that you may bear your disgrace and be ashamed of all that you have done, becoming a consolation to them. As for your sister Sodom and her daughter shall return to their former state, and Samaria and her daughter shall return to their former state, and you and your daughter shall return to your former state. Was not your sister Sodom a byword in your mouth in the day of your pride? Before your wickedness was uncovered, when it was hidden and no one knew about what you were doing, didn't you talk about how bad Sodom was? Now you have become an object of reproach for your daughters, or for the daughters of Syria and all those around her, and for the daughters of the Philistines and all those who despise you. You bear the penalty of your lewdness and your abominations, declares the Lord. All of this is the prophet using what they already knew about Sodom and Gomorrah to help them see the state that they themselves were in. He's saying to them, you're not any different than they are. These are the people who had received the word of God, that were the chosen people, the people who had received the law, the people who had the prophets, the people who were led by the kings of the Lord, the people who went to Jerusalem to worship in the temple, who kept the Sabbath, the people who observed all the feasts. These are the people that he says, you're worse than the Sodomites. And you need to wake up and realize that it has happened to you. We look at those kinds of events and we think that would never happen to me. That would never happen. Yes, it will, unless we're vigilant to work and prevent it from happening. Yes, sir. Exactly. Right. And he even points out, though, in one place when he says that these are the sins of your sister Sodom. And he names the lewdness that they were involved in wasn't really what he talked about there. He was talking about their prosperity and their pride and their arrogance and their forgetting God and their not willing to help people who were needy, even though they had an abundance and even more food than they could eat. Can you imagine? Well, yeah, I think we can imagine it because I think sometimes we do it. I have more food in front of me than I can actually physically eat, but I'm not giving it to you. Who does that? And we do, if we're not careful. If we don't work to be different than that, to think different than that, if we don't listen to the truth of God and become what He would have us be. Now, if anybody has rung a bell today, I haven't heard it, but the clock says it's time for me to stop. So, I'm going to do that, and we're going to pick up next time, Lord willing, at Amos chapter 4, and look at the next example of Sodom presented in the Bible. Then after we finish this, as you can see on the slide behind me, we're going to We're going to pull this narrative and the narrative of the flood together and look at the similarities and talk about what that means. And that's my direction, at least my plan right now. Thanks for your presence and participation.